So as we continue our discussion on Jonathan Hickman's Fantastic Four, what we do now is we pick up with the death of Johnny Storm. Now, Johnny Storm dying was a huge deal. It was a very big deal. And the reason why is because throughout the history of the Fantastic Four, the only person who ever really died, kind of, was Ben Grimm. And that was why we saw the Fantastic Four traveling to the realm of the One Above All. And that's where we learned that the One Above All is effectively Jack Kirby, or at least some people say is Jack Kirby. In all honesty, it could be Jack Kirby or Stan Lee. It's just people cite that because it was in comics. I can't really blame them for it. But the fact remains that with the death of Johnny Storm, this is actually preluded by an event called the War of the Four Cities. And if you guys recall our discussions in the early videos on Hickman's Fantastic Four, we had talked about how the future version of Franklin Richards had traveled into the past to visit his younger self and wake up his powers, but he had also told Valeria Richards that there was going to be a War of the Four Cities. Now, within this story, we pick up in part with the Future Foundation. Now, in the last video, we talked about how the Future Foundation was a group formed by Reed Richards using children. And the reason why he wanted to use children is because they're not impacted by the world's politics. They don't make their decisions based off religious motives. They don't care about political allegiances. All they care about is what their imagination can let them achieve. And so they're effectively untainted by the real world. And so using children allows Reed to basically do whatever he wants to when it comes to the idea of trying to solve the problem of everything, about trying to make the world a better place. And so with this War of the Four Cities, we're actually going to have to delve into some history of Marvel Comics. Now, a lot of this is currently being covered in my series, A History of the Marvel Universe, but some of the stuff we're going to talk about, we haven't gotten to yet. Now, with regards to the first of the four cities, this is Old Atlantis. Now, in Marvel Comics, way back in the day when the Earth was basically new, when life was appearing for the very first time, the Celestials showed up on Earth and they began experimenting on humans, on primitive man. And they created the Deviants and they created the Eternals, and then they left normal humans alone, save for the fact that the genes of normal humans were modified so that at some future point in time, they would begin developing superpowers. For some people, this was a predisposition towards being bitten by a radioactive spider and becoming Spider-Man instead of dying. For other individuals, it was the activation of a gene that would grant them powers, which was the case of mutants. But the fact remains that with this period in time, those humans who were not enslaved by the Deviants after the Eternals had basically bailed off, began forming their own cultures and their own civilizations. And the central hub, so to speak, of civilization on Earth at the time was Atlantis. It was a giant trading hub. Technology was advanced far more than it is right now in Marvel Comics, which is interesting, and we'll explain why here in a second. But it was this massive interweaving. It was like the Roman Empire before the Roman Empire. And so what ended up happening here is the Celestials came back to basically see how their work, how their experiment was progressing. And the result was that the Deviants believed that the Celestials were wanting to take over the world. And so the Deviants attacked the Celestials. Now, while this was happening, the advanced citizens on Atlantis realized that this conflict would likely lay waste to the surface. And so what they did is they immersed their city in domes of an unknown composition in preparation for the coming destruction. And that's exactly what happened. The war between the Deviants and the Celestials initiated what's called the Great Cataclysm, basically meaning that almost all technology was wiped out and Atlantis sank to the bottom of the ocean. And so once Atlantis dropped off, you had various themes and various groups that were forming, but within Atlantis, you had a subsect of people that carried on the tradition of the old ways. They never let go of the past. This continued on until the modern day, and this is part of the War of the Four Cities. These people who hold on to past traditions, who don't really follow the ideologies of Namor the Submariner, have come to the conclusion that it's high time that Atlantis take over the surface. They basically return back to the surface world and begin conquering all over again. And so what's going to happen here is that they are going to find themselves in a conflict with what are called the Universal Inhumans. Now, after the Celestials had showed up on Earth and meddled with the genes of humanity, the Kree race on the far side of the universe had realized what was going on. Of course, they had been fighting the Skrulls for quite some time, but because the war took place across the universe, you had different battle stations, you had different territories that operated as military campaign points and things like that, and the Earth was in a very strategic location. It was basically in a place to where if it were conquered, it could easily sway the tide of battle. And so what what ended up happening here is the Kree saw the Celestials meddling with the genes of humanity, creating the Deviants and the Eternals. And so what they did is they took a subsect of humans and they modified their genes so that when these humans were exposed to the Terrigen mists, they would undergo a transformation into any number of races who in turn would go into those particular races, start civil wars, and allow the Kree to basically take over that planet and then continue their expansion of their own empire. Now, somewhere along the line, the leader of the Kree race, the Supreme Intelligence, realized that if this happened long enough, eventually it would lead to the Kree's own destruction. And so what ended up happening is the Supreme Intelligence ordered that all of these inhuman projects be completely eliminated, and all of them were, except for 5. You had the Chameleons, you had the Badoon, and you had a handful of others. Of course, you had the Inhumans on the planet Earth. And so this represents the second of the 4 cities. And what happened is that these universal Inhumans, the races that exist way out on different parts of the universe, have decided that it's time to take over the planet Earth. Now, with regards to the 3rd city, this is what's called the Forever City. On the planet Earth, there is a guy named Herbert Wyndham, but most likely you've heard him referred to as the High Evolutionary. And he was a guy from the 1930s who was obsessed with genetics. He was actually a really big deal. He was really involved with the studies of Mr. Sinister. And we'll actually get to a discussion in my videos on a history of the Marvel Universe with regards to Mr. Sinister, because he was responsible for a lot of different things. He was responsible for Cyclops, the meddling of his powers when he was younger. He was responsible for the creation of the Weapons Plus project, which led to Captain America. It led to Wolverine. It led to Deadpool. Mr. Sinister was behind the motivation and why it is that we know that if Cyclops and Jean Grey ever had a child, it'd be wildly powerful. Mr. Sinister is behind a lot of things that have taken place in the realm of science in Marvel Comics as a whole. But because Herbert Wyndham, because the High Evolutionary was so obsessed with genes, what he ended up doing was basically performing experiments on himself. The problem with this was he was considered crazy by his contemporaries, by various scientists in the 1930s at the time, and so he was effectively ousted from the scientific community. And so he took up residence in a place called Wundagore Mountain, and what he did is he began basically modifying the genes of animals in order to to speed up their evolution, to basically make them human-like, so to speak. And the fact that they could talk, in terms of the fact that they were bipedal, so on and so forth. He had his group called the Newmen. Well, while all this was happening, he also had the intention of taking over the world. And so what he did is he went underground and he created a place called the Forever City. And the Forever City was basically a location whereby he had an evolution machine. It would allow him to basically speed up the evolution of all beings on the planet Earth, all of whom would swear allegiance to him because he would present himself as their leader. The problem with this was that when he activated the machine, he considered it a failure because of the fact that the machine actually forced those who were exposed to it to revert in evolution, meaning they would go backwards in evolution, they wouldn't go forward. And so he effectively abandoned the Forever City. And so as time progressed and various underground creatures like the Maloids and so on and so forth discovered this Forever City, they began calling it the Lost City of the High Evolutionary. This represents the 3rd city in the War of the 4 Cities. And the reason why is because those who are currently occupying this territory have decided that it's now their time to take over the surface world. Now, the final city in this discussion, and the one that actually leads directly into the death of Johnny Storm, is the Negative Zone and the forces of Annihilus. Now, what this does is this actually picks up after an event called Annihilation. Now, for those of you guys who never read Annihilation, it was a really, really good story, and it actually coincided with the events of Civil War. And it was really interesting the way these two stories compared and contrasted with one another. And the reason why is because the connection between the two was Richard Rider of the Nova Corps. And what had happened is that while Captain America and Iron Man were feuding on the planet Earth, in the Negative Zone, Annihilus had basically discovered the Negative Zone's equivalent of the power cosmic, the power that Galactus wields. And so because Annihilus is obsessed with killing everybody in order to ensure that he can't die, that no one can conquer him, Annihilus took over the Negative Zone and then invaded the main 616 universe and began unleashing a horde of its forces. It was called the Annihilation Wave, and it basically spread like a plague throughout the universe, conquering planets, killing everything that it came across. It was one of the most impressive displays of death and destruction in the history of Marvel Comics. Now, Now, where this led, of course, to the capture of Galactus and different things like that going on, and there were a lot of themes that were taking place, and it even led into the formation of the Guardians of the Galaxy under Star-Lord. What ended up happening here is once Annihilus was defeated, he was basically confined back to the negative zone. He was basically stuck there. And so what ended up happening here is the Fantastic Four, the Future Foundation, and these various forces were going about their own normal business. But within the Marvel Universe, you had what I think was called the Court of the Negative Zone, or the Court of Annihilus, or something along those lines. But it was basically the remnants of the Annihilation Wave who had taken up residence on Earth and were operating to ensure Annihilus could actually come back and succeed in wiping out all life in the Earth 616 universe. And so what ended up happening is that because Reed Richards was the first person to discover the negative zone, because he's consistently had a portal that accesses the negative zone, the court had basically surrounded the Baxter building by virtue of jobs and businesses and so on and so forth, and then invaded the Baxter building and opened up the portal. And so for the first time in Hickman's run of the Fantastic Four, Franklin Richards lets everyone know that his powers have returned when he wipes out the forces of the Annihilation Wave, or the preemptive forces. But what happens is that the Future Foundation, Franklin Richards and Johnny Storm and those guys, go into the negative zone for the purpose of destroying Annihilus's forces to ensure that he can never invade the Earth 616 universe again. And so what happens here is that while they're doing the best they can, ultimately they're overwhelmed because Annihilus has billions of soldiers, billions with a B. He's got so many soldiers, it's unbelievable. And so what ends up happening is the Future Foundation basically bails out, but someone has to stay behind, and they have to basically lock the door and then randomize the access code so that no one can figure out how to gain access again. No one can get in and no one can get out. And so what ends up happening here is Johnny Storm stays behind. And this to me is one of the best moments in Hickman's run, because Johnny Storm he's not scared, he's not afraid, he doesn't care. He's angry and he's confident because he turns around and he says 1,000,000,000, and then he just says flame on, and then it immediately cuts to the end of the comic. Now, when this happened, when Hickman revealed that Johnny Storm was basically dead, it took the comic book world by storm. There's no better way to say that. It sent shockwaves. No, there had never been an instance when Johnny Storm had died, because the Fantastic Four just don't die. It doesn't happen. Sometimes the X-Men die, sometimes Captain America gives up. There's been a couple times where Captain America supposedly died, but it turned out he was alive. Thor died, and Thor disassembled during the events of Ragnarok. But the members of the Fantastic Four don't die. That's off limits. You don't kill them. And so it was a huge surprise to see Johnny Storm killed off. Now, that being said, with Johnny Storm being dead, with Fantastic Four issue number 588, Hickman gave us a comic that had no words. It was literally all just images, but I will tell you guys right now, this is one of the best comics that you're ever going to see. And the reason why is because it literally just gives us stages. We don't have to read what's happening to know what's going on. And what's really interesting about this is that because Ben Grimm was the one that had to basically watch Johnny Storm die, that had to watch Johnny Storm sacrifice his life, this impacts Ben Grimm more than anything else. And what this does is it initially picks up with a call to arms. I mean, the Avengers, basically everyone shows up. Everyone's like, oh my God, Johnny Storm's dead. Because in the realm of Marvel Comics, the Fantastic Four are basically royalty, guys. It's like watching a prince, or a king or queen die. It's an insane thing to see. And so the superhero community, whether they're villains or otherwise, are in total shock. And so of course you have Thor, you have Wolverine, you have the new Avengers, more or less, Captain America, Iron Man. They show up and they visit the Future Foundation, they visit the Fantastic Four, and the response from Ben Grimm is he doesn't know what to do. He's just kind of lost here, because despite the banter that he and Johnny Storm had, the fact that they would bicker all the time, once you got past, what seemed to be bitterness between the two, all you found was love. Ben Grimm and Johnny Storm had a strong connection with one another because they were effectively the best of friends. And we knew that because when it came down to it, when it came down to the Fantastic Four fighting together, Ben Grimm had Johnny's back and Johnny had Ben Grimm's back. But now, in the eyes of Ben Grimm, no one's got his corner. No one is behind him. And so what happens is that when Susan Storm returns from her mission, she's told that Johnny Storm is dead. And again, the shock on her face is absolute shock and absolute, a crushing sensation, because once we get into day 3, we learn that with her brother being dead, she spent almost the entire time isolated. She's been away from everybody. She will not let Reed Richards touch her. She will not let anybody have anything to do with her. And so on day 4, Reed Richards goes to his weapons facility in the Baxter building and grabs the ultimate nullifier. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, the ultimate nullifier is a big deal. This thing is capable of just wiping out anything. Now, what it destroys is relative to the drive, to the ambition, and the intelligence of the person who wields it. But because Reed Richards is in such an emotional state, and because he's so angry, and because he's so intelligent, he could simply press the button and wipe out the universe if he wanted to. And that's what he does. He goes to the portal of the negative zone. He effectively, accesses it, as he's not able to cross through into the portal, but he can see into the inside, and he sees Annihilus, and he basically threatens him with the ultimate nullifier. And Annihilus just presents him with a shirt of Johnny Storm, and that's all it takes. That's all it takes. And so Reed Richards just kind of walks away. And so what we do is we move to day 5, which is effectively the funeral for Johnny Storm. And we see everyone here, almost every single superhero that's ever been important in the lives of the Fantastic Four are present here. And so as these individuals are talking to one another, as they're speaking with one another, Ben Grimm gets angry. Now, this, I think, is one of the absolute best moments of the story, because with the stages of grief, the stages of dealing with someone who dies, anger is one of the most prominent and one of the most dangerous stages, depending on, how close you were to the loved one that you lost. And so what ends up happening here is, of course, Dr. Doom actually vacates Latveria for a time. He puts Christopher Nard in charge, and he actually leaves and goes to pay his respects to the Fantastic Four. But we also see Spider-Man spending time with Franklin Richards. Now, this will be important because what's actually going to happen is there's going to be a story where Spider-Man works with Franklin on how to deal with the fact that Johnny Storm died. And this, again, is a really good story. If you ask Sal, if you go, you tweet Comic Pop and you ask him, what do you think about Spider-Man's, conversation with Franklin Richards after the death of Johnny Storm, he'll tell you it's one of the best stories that he's ever read in the history of Marvel Comics. And so we switch over to Valeria Richards and the Future Foundation. And what's interesting, and what I hope you guys notice about this, is everyone's dealing with the situation in their own way. Initially, the Future Foundation have their own ideas. The thought is maybe we replace Johnny Storm with someone else, with She-Hulk, Storm, Black Panther, Wyatt Wingfoot, who has long since been an ally to the Fantastic Four and a close personal friend of Johnny Storm. But she erases all that, and she says the only thing they need to do before they do anything else is kill Annihilus. And so what we do here, and this I said, this is why I think this is one of the best moments of the entirety of the story, is we pick up with Ben Grimm. And what happens is that on day 26, Ben Grimm meets with Bruce Banner and with Donald Blake, the human form of Thor. And of course, we see that Donald Blake has a stick, or his cane, which if he hits on the ground, it will turn into the hammer of Mjolnir, and he'll become Thor. And so what happens is they present him with with an image of Johnny Storm. And initially, Ben Grimm doesn't want to have anything to do with it. And so Donald Blake transforms into Thor, and he and Ben Grimm begin fighting one another. And then Bruce Banner changes into the Incredible Hulk, and they start fighting. All three are getting into a conflict, and they're battling. And initially, this seems as though they're picking a fight, but what they're doing here is they're letting Ben Grimm work out his anger. They're letting him work through his hatred and his rage, because Ben Grimm is so strong. If he were to freak out, and if he were to just start attacking anything, he would almost lay waste to the planet. But both Thor and the Incredible Hulk are two of the only people in existence who can withstand a beating from Ben Grimm almost completely unfazed. And so this is why I say this is such a great story, or such a great aspect of the story, because this is basically just Ben Grimm coping with the death of his best friend. And so what we do as we begin to wrap this up, as we begin to bring this to an end, is we join Reed Richards on day 29. And this is Hickman kind of bringing us back to reality. This is Hickman bringing us back to the story, saying, okay, you guys have had your time to focus on the death of Johnny Storm. We have to get back to the bigger picture here. We have to get back to this great big huge story arc that he's giving us. And so while Reed Richards is going over his list of things, the idea that the negative zone may be invading the planet Earth, the idea idea that the Universal Inhumans want to conquer the planet Earth, Franklin Richards' power set. These are all important things that are, a major threat to them. Galactus possibly trying to consume Earth is a big deal. And for those of you guys who don't know, this harkens back to the original appearance of Galactus in Marvel Comics when he first met the Fantastic Four. The fact that Galactus was forced out on bad terms meant the possibility existed that Galactus could come back at any point in time and consume the Earth, and there would be virtually nothing the superheroes could really do to stop him. But more so than that, Reed Richards says that the reformation of the Council of Reeds is necessary. And this is something that I'd love for you guys to keep in the back of your head, because this will be very important later on down the line. But as this begins to come to a close, what happens is Reed Richards is met with the arrival of his father, Nathaniel Richards. With that being said, we're going to go ahead and bring this video to an end. And I hope you guys are enjoying Hickman's run of the Fantastic Four so far. And I will catch you guys later. Peace.